All right. Just gonna jump in. Agriculture. Guns, Germs, and Steel did us a good benefit of showing us a lot of the early agriculture, and a lot of the development that was around agriculture in different places around the world that had the first agricultural revolutions. They had very similar housing that they made, right? Because with the invention of agriculture came the division of labor, and people being settled rather than hunting and gathering, right? Hunters and gatherers around the world have been at this point mostly displaced due to, different civilizations that developed agriculture and became more prosperous, had more people, and they spread out around the world. A lot of the main kind of centers of agriculture are places that went on to kind of get a lot of local successes. Similar to Guns, Germs, and Steel, or when we were reading about environmental determinism, there are actual, physical limitations to where certain types of agriculture can be, where they can locate, and how prosperous they could be in a nutshell. So we got a couple maps here from our book. One showing kind of general climate regions, and this would be probably about as what you would expect as far as, where's tropical, where's polar, right? And the above one might be a bit different than something you would expect, because within all of this, you have lots of microclimates, right? And so you have this area here that's basically just categorized as highland. Highland areas around the world tend to be multiple different types of climates, just depending on the elevation, right? The higher you climb on a mountain, the colder it gets. That's why they're often snow-capped, even in a place that's relatively warm, right? And so you could have in these examples lots of places that are in the tropics, for example, but they could put crops that are for colder weather just in higher elevations. This is kind of a big innovation when it comes to humanity. And in general, these climate regions, they mimic how much sun places get plus how much rain places get, right? And there's subtle differences here and there. So for example, you have ocean current that goes this way, and what that does is it makes Europe warmer than it would otherwise be. Because if you look at how far north Europe is compared to North America, well, this current goes like this, and so it's bringing warm water and warmer temperatures up here, but then it's doing the reverse to us, and it's actually making the temperatures all along here. This is why you don't actually see a lot of people living in this part of Canada and whatnot, because you got a lot of cold water coming over here and making the whole place a bit chilly. Actually, we're not going to do this activity. But we'll look at this map that in general shows cropland around the world. And again, it might be somewhat what you'd expect. In general, through most of the world, this mimics population patterns, right? Because you need a lot of agriculture in order to sustain large populations. Some areas on here that it actually doesn't correlate that much. So for example, this region of the US, right? This is not a huge population cluster. Most of our populations are on the coast and whatnot, some kind of inland here, but a lot of these areas here that grow a lot of crops, that means we have a lot of extra food that's cheaper, and so that's part of the reason why for a long time this area of the US was considered the breadbasket of the world, right? More recently, you can see this area here, a lot of cropland. This is Ukraine right here. This is why during this whole war that's been going on, there's been news stories about them trying to ship out crops, because much of the poorer population of the world, they get their food from this area. It's much more affordable. We also, we'll sell our food, anyone will buy it, but it tends to be more expensive, partially because we have more inputs into it, right? We spend more money on it. We'll go into that more detail as we go. Just wanted to show that map real quick. I forgot my water. Oh, can't lecture without my water though. Does anyone in this class work in agriculture or maybe brought up on a farm? Any of those types of situations? Not really? I mean, that's, no coincidence. That's been a major transformation of our economy through time. Of course, early America, very agricultural based, but through time, through mechanization and whatnot, need less and less people to do it, right? Well, back on talking about climate regions and whatnot, most of the climate regions are pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy to figure out from their descriptions and from where they are. Although, like I said, the highland climate region has a lot of microclimates. I should also mention, well, there's a temperature categorization that is the Mediterranean agriculture, and sometimes that gets a little confusing because the Mediterranean is an actual place, whereas the Mediterranean climate is in lots of different places, and that there are climates that mimic this. What that means is, well, it tends to be a bit drier, a bit warmer. Also, the Mediterranean itself, if you ever visit, Spain or Italy and whatnot, the kind of classic areas that are often used as examples of Mediterranean climate, they have a long dry season, right? And you might not realize it, but a lot of the plants and whatnot, the crops that are from there, they're very often drought resistant. That's why they're popular in lots of places. So, you go to California, it's not the Mediterranean, but it has a Mediterranean climate, so lots of the same crops. And also, actually, well, if you've ever noticed, if you ever walked up close to like a grapevine and noticed that the actual bark is like super thick, that's because these climate regions, because they tend to have long dry seasons, they also tend to have lots of fires. And so the plants are pretty hardy when it comes to resisting fire. They've built up these different kind of defenses where sometimes they actually help them germinate. Sometimes, like I said, they have a thick bark. Things like this have made them popular because California also has dry seasons, but also kind of known for lots of fires, seasonal fires. All right. We're not going to do this reflection activity. Different types of agriculture. Of course, there's lots of different types of agriculture. Some of the main categories, I would say, when we're looking at subsistence agriculture versus commercial agriculture, usually people just kind of think of this as kind of old-fashioned classic agriculture versus more modern agriculture, right? Subsistence agriculture, and this is still done in a number of areas around the world, and that's basically you're growing crops for your family and kind of sometimes your small community, but you're not growing extra, and you don't have any plans of growing enough to sell it, because that just isn't something you need to do, right? Most places around the world before modern day capitalism kind of spread everywhere, it's like, well, you grow extra food, you can't really ship it far, and so it expires, and it wasn't as good of a commercial product. Plus, honestly, the people who were involved in it, they weren't interested in working and maximizing their productivity. They were just kind of making ends meet. Commercial agriculture, very different, right? Because you're not growing it for your family, sure, if you have a corn farm, you may personally eat some of the corn, but by and far, your family's not living off of corn, right? Your family's living off of other foods that you get for selling the corn. One of the main differences between kind of older classic agricultural systems and modern agricultural systems is that, well, these days we use monocultures, right? So you'll grow, for example, in this example, corn. You'll have one specific variety of corn that you put it on a very large area of land, whereas traditional agriculture, they used to mix things more, right? And so you would actually plant different species together. So kind of mimicking crop rotation that we do today. Crop rotation today, let's say you grow some corn, it takes a lot of nitrates out of the soils. So it's like, well, how do you put the nitrates back into the soils? Buy a lot of expensive fertilizer, or you just plant beans the next year, and that puts the nitrogen back in the soil, and you just kind of rotate your crops, right? Classically, it used to be you would actually put these crops and you'd have them growing at the same time, and maybe some other things. You'd have some banana trees or something else in the same space, but as you can imagine, that's a lot of work, and it was a lot of work. It's fallen by the wayside mostly because it's really difficult to mechanize, right? And it's like, well, when you can mechanize things, when you develop machinery for farming, you could grow and harvest huge amounts, whereas if you have to rely on individual people to do every little thing, and that would include coming in here and pulling out weeds, getting rid of pests, all these different things people would have to do by hand. Bid rent theory. This chapter just goes into this topic a little bit, and then the next chapter elaborates on it more. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. Basically, in a nutshell, bid rent theory, what it means is that, well, if your farm happens to locate near an urban settlement of some kind, well, you can usually get more money for your crops. So usually it's in your interest to have more intensive use of that land. So you'll spend some more money on fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, and buying the latest cutting edge crops or whatever. But the further out you go, well, the less demand. And it's not that agriculture doesn't happen far from urban areas, but it tends to be less intensive and has less money to spend. So it's less productive in general. And so it's different types of agriculture that require less resources, I guess I would say. And we're not going to do a case study. This chapter talks a bit about the division of land for farms, not just in the U.S. but around the world. I would say, well, the examples of long lot survey systems where you have these long lots, these are more common in Europe, very often because you'll have at one end perhaps a source of water. I don't see on this image that there's a specific source of water, but it looks like this might be a river because that's typically what you have next to rivers. You have more trees and whatnot because there's more water. Usually in any landscape, if it's grassland or forested with trees, that's just an indication of how much groundwater there is in that area, because you need a lot more groundwater to support trees. This system, like I said, very popular in Europe. This used to be larger lots, but what happened was, you would have the next generation that would inherit the farm, right? And then they would kind of split that up by that generation, and then that generation would have kids, and at a certain point they just had to stop kind of splitting these up because you would have these very long lines of property that were all very kind of squished. The US is a very different system, mostly because our property system was put in much more recently comparison-wise to say Europe, which a lot of these systems were put in place maybe thousands of years ago, whereas in the US did not have this type of extensive agriculture thousands of years ago. Lots of the country didn't even have this extensive of agriculture hundreds of years ago, right? Pretty modern system. I will say, they call these townships, these areas that are 6 miles by 6 miles, but don't be confused with them being actual towns or anything. That's just kind of a term that's used. These distances of how big these townships were made, of 6 miles by 6 miles, that is a product of the transportation technology of the time. That is, how long you could reasonably expect to go a distance of time on horseback. And so we're kind of stuck with this older system. I'm not gonna check. Settlement patterns. Well, it's kind of interesting because he's talk about how these are quote unquote rural settlement patterns, but very much these are more of a product of the transportation technology that was available at the time that towns were settled, right? And so, like in Minnesota, most of our small towns came about, well, before the railroads were even in. People had to get there by horse, and there wasn't a lot of travel and whatnot, so things were just pretty dispersed. Once the trains started going in and tracks started being laid, this is why today, even if you're driving around in rural Minnesota, if you go to a small town, you might notice that everything is kind of lined up on the tracks, and the tracks that are often still there, sometimes still in use, very often not. But that's why these cities were all in these kind of lines. Well, I would say clustered has happened through time as the trolley system took over from trains, and then the automobile especially, right? That is when, well, people clustered. First they clustered, and then they kind of sprawled. But our next unit in here after agriculture is on urbanization, so we'll talk about more details of how that changed through history when we get there. I'm gonna have you announce this stuff. Intensive agriculture. I would say intensive agriculture, even if it's subsistence, right? Subsistence being the kind of older form of agriculture. The example they have from the book here is rice planting and harvesting. As you can see from this image, it tends to be very labor intensive, right? And it tends to, again, you're not really making food for export, you're making it for more than just the family, the local community, but you don't have plans for exporting. Thought I'd get some other images of rice harvesting since it's one of the kind of biggest crops that there are. You do need standing water, which might seem like, well, that'd be difficult to do on hillsides, but of course, since land is at a premium in lots of places around the world, especially where there's populations, people have carved out through mountains different areas where you could do rice planting, rice cultivation, and rice harvesting. I actually went to an area of China that had this. Historically, this is the agriculture that they had used. Oh no, the name has jumped out of my brain. It'll come back to me before we finish. But this is a region that has actually had a bit of a, they've had to change their agriculture a bit. They've had to pivot. What the locals told me was that it's just kind of becoming drier, and you need standing water for rice, and so they've done a lot of switching over. And so in this specific example, I actually went here because they were known for their rice fields in their terraced mountains. But they had switched to a different crop. I don't know if you could see this in the picture. This is actually a little thing that people are carrying. Some of the tourists, if you wanted to pay extra, you could have them haul you around. I didn't pay for that. I felt like I didn't want them carrying my heavy self around. But as I was saying, they had to change. They changed to, you probably can't tell what these are, but these are peppers. People have had Chinese food, and you've had red peppers in your Chinese food. These are the little things that they're carrying people around. I will say it's a lot of ups and downs, but not impossible to get across. But as you can see, these mountains, this is in, when I was talking about microclimates and whatnot, this is not central China, but a bit further in from the cities. But as you can see, huge areas of land that would not have been productive have been changed into very productive agriculture. Although, like I said, they're growing peppers instead of rice because it's gotten drier. and per unit, it gets a higher price. They take them and they lye them out and dry them out so that they don't weigh very much. And then someone had a pet duck when we're on our bus back. It's kind of funny. All right, still on intensive agriculture. As I mentioned, monocropping, monoculture, crop rotation actually is, when it comes to agriculture, a relatively recent phenomena. What had happened was similar to what we saw in guns, germs, and steel. A lot of early agriculture, people didn't know a ton about what they were doing. They knew enough, but they exhausted the soils, right? People really didn't have a good conception of, well, how do we keep the soil from being depleted? And it wasn't until many years later that they were like, oh, if you plant beans, and we'll put stuff in the soil. If you then switch it with wheat or corn or whatever else, then you could kind of keep your soils going. This example, agriculture, a lot of places don't have leveled fields, right? And it's like, well, you still need food, you still need to eat, and so planting on hillsides. In this example, they're also putting in different types of crops to kind of keep the land together. I would say also classically to try to keep, a lot of these areas used to be forested, and they'll try to keep the trees kind of in different areas, again, to kind of hold the soil together. Monocropping and monoculture, these are good in many ways because it could make you, if you're focused on one variety, you could try to create hybrid seeds and make them more productive and do things like that. The main problem, and this is more of a problem historically, is that, like I said, these all take one nutrient out of the soil without putting it back. But also because it's a monocrop, if there's like a pest that specializes in that, it could take out huge amounts, whereas if you had different types of crops, it would kind of only be able to take out some. Not just like bugs, but various ailments that plants get. Intensive agriculture, plantation agriculture. I will say, in the US, when people hear the term plantation, they kind of think of a specific form of agriculture. And in the US, we largely kind of don't use that term anymore, but the rest of the world, they often do. And people will kind of picture, because the old plantation agriculture is so tied to slavery, people will be on a trip somewhere and they'll say, oh, you want to see the plantation? And they'll think to themselves, oh, is there slavery still in this country? And it's like, no, they just use that same term because it's the same lot of land and it's still agriculture, but it's paid and it's market rates and whatnot. Market gardening, well, what that means is usually these are close to urban areas. I would say locally, examples of these are like, especially at the farmers markets. I don't know if people ever go to farmers markets, but if you want to see some locally grown stuff, you go to a local farmers market and see what varieties they have. They tend to be close to the city, right? Because they're bringing their stuff in every weekend, usually. All right. Extensive agriculture, I would say around the world, the further away you get from urban areas, the more it can be kind of extensive, meaning you have large areas of land and you're doing agriculture that doesn't take a lot of inputs. So something like, the cattle industry kind of in the American plains, right? It's large amounts of grazing land. The land itself is not super productive, but it doesn't have to be, it just has to grow some grass. Things like that. We've talked about slash and burn agriculture a little bit before. I would say that in general, when people hear the term shifting cultivation, they think that means crop rotation, but it's more of the slash and burn variety. Like I said, I think I brought this up before, but technically slash and burn at a subsistence level, it was very small scale. You'd have a large forest, and as I've said before, in tropical climates, there's a lot of rain, and the rain leaches nutrients out of the soil. So what you could do is you could chop down a section of the forest, dries out pretty quickly if you chop it so it's not getting moisture from its roots, and then you set it on fire. That clears your land, and the ash and whatnot you could use as fertilizer for crops for at least a year and maybe like 3 to 5 years. And then when the soil starts getting depleted, well, you just pack up and you just move down a bit, and that area can just regenerate, and it's not a bad thing. What's happened through time, though, the slash and burn agriculture has turned into, well, I showed you the video about the palm oil plantations in Indonesia. They've turned to just permanent cultivation, right? And they've turned into, you know, they're not burning it even for the nutrients or whatnot. They're burning it just to do a clean sweep of the land. And I would say very often this land afterward, it never goes back to being tropical rainforest. Usually what happens is they just kind of allow grasses and stuff to come in, and then they turn it into grazing land. And there's tons of that in Central and South America, for example. There's been tons of land it's been slash and burn agriculture, but it's permanent, and now it's just grazing land in kind of a bit of a different climate than it was before. Well, as I was saying, since it's extensive subsistence agriculture, an example of grazing animals, right? And often you will have populations that maybe even move seasonally with those animals. They don't necessarily have to all move. Sometimes it's just some people. This was, of course, historically a lot more common in a larger part of the economy in lots of areas, especially the U.S. when it comes to, well, cattle raising. A lot of places have just turned into utilizing feedlots, right? Because, well, yeah, that's more productive per unit of space that you use compared to this. Although, you know, watch a documentary about feedlots and you'll think maybe there shouldn't be feedlots. Extensive agriculture, like I said, little investment, large amounts of land. This also requires that you're able to use large areas of land. So in the US, there's lots of areas that are technically public space that are owned by the government that ranchers are allowed to ranch. Ranchers don't always have to own all the land that they're putting their animals out to. If it wasn't for that, there'd be a lot less of it, right? Because it's, I mean, who could afford these huge amounts of space that cattle will graze on? Map of different types of farming around the world. I would say that this isn't the best map because it's well, there's lots of microclimates and there's a lot more going on than these things. So for example, if you look at the colors that are in our region, right, that would lead you to believe that we're all dairy farmers here, right? Dairy farming, especially in Minnesota, has been a declining industry. It's been on the decline for many years, partially because, well, Wisconsin is just a little bit closer to the population center of Chicago in that area. And so Wisconsin has always been able to make just a bit more money than Minnesota when it comes to dairy products. And so that's part of the reason why, you know, Wisconsin identity is kind of tied to dairy more than, say, Minnesota. Grain farming, I can't quite tell if it includes where Minnesota is, because they didn't include the Great Lakes. That's always where I can tell where Minnesota is I look at where the Great Lakes are, and they just took them off there. But again, you know, grain farming, I would say yes, that would be more correct assessments. In lots of these areas, it's a good overview though, I'll say that. Oh, and that reminds me of, well, now all of you have had a GIS day where you worked in maps and looked at changing the colors of maps of things. I will say, these classic land elevation maps are just the worst, because just like the map on the side there, that's kind of the staple preset way to label elevation is by these colors, but it makes it seem like these areas that are green are all like full of vegetation and whatnot, right? Very misleading map as far as I'm concerned. So even though I had some qualms about this map, it's a heck of a lot better than this is the other map that this chapter used right next to it. And it's kind of like, this is not a useful map for people. I'm not gonna have you do that. You know, like I said, again, Guns, Germs, and Steel really did good to kind of set up a lot of the context for this chapter. In this image, this is from this chapter as well. This is farming in desert areas. Farming in desert areas tends to be, as you can imagine, a bit more piecemeal than places that have a bit more water. You can see you have like individual croppings here in little areas that individual farmers can kind of like have a focus on. But if they wanted to kind of expand their range or whatnot, it's pretty hard to do, right? It's like, well, you may have just enough water for a certain area. Well, like I said, before the agricultural revolution, you know, humans were hunters and gatherers, that was a perfectly sustainable way of living for most of human existence, right? So most of our existence as humans, people were just out finding things and seeing if they could eat it, right? It took a very good knowledge of plants and animals where you were. You had to have really good knowledge of geography. But you know, this is before the written word. This is before agriculture, so this is also before settlements. Yet most of human history and kind of maybe what makes us as beings are from that time. I would say humans still very much have an instinct to, when they're walking around, you know, like if you're walking in the woods, you'll see a stick that's like, oh, this is a really straight stick that you'll notice, and it's like, oh, could I use any of these things and whatnot? That's kind of how the brain naturally goes. When it comes to the start of agriculture, this map in the book actually does a pretty good job of showing a lot of the kind of central places that agriculture was, if not invented, was one of the kind of earlier places. Focuses a lot on the Fertile Crescent because, you know, that was the first of them. But it seems like in general, although this population, after they depleted the soils and whatnot, they kind of moved and they kind of went wherever they could, and they brought agriculture with them. There's still places that seem to have developed it pretty independently, rather than it being diffused to them. They just, you know, humans just kind of thought it up within a few thousand years of each other. Which again, if you think about the broad sweep of time, a few thousand years figuring something out, a few thousand years after other people did that you're not in communication with, that's not that bad. Diffusion of agriculture. This is another image from this chapter where they're getting ready to plant corn, it said. And this was in China. And I would say a lot of the plants and animals that we take for granted in different people's diets and whatnot, these were separate areas of the world for many, many years, right? So what I mean is, well, they're growing corn. Corn isn't from here, right? Isn't from China. It's from the Americas. And not only that, well, we grow a ton of corn in Minnesota, like a lot. But corn itself is a warm weather plant. And classically, like Central America is where you would have to live to have corn. Corn takes a lot of water. And it was only through picking different varieties. Wheat as well, right? Wheat comes from the Fertile Crescent. This is a dry, warm climate. And it's only through changing the varieties that people were able to make them more and more hardy. When I say hardy, being able to go to a bit colder climates and still be very productive. The Columbian Exchange, right? And it's, in lots of ways, it's difficult to picture the food of the world before the Columbian Exchange. You know, because before Columbus, if you had Italian food in Italy, you know, it wouldn't involve any tomatoes, right? Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? It's like, well, they didn't. Tomatoes are from the Americas, right? They just literally did not have that. So diets were very different. The kind of nutrients people had access to were very different. But once this happened and there was international trade of all these varieties, it allowed for the development of a lot of pallets, a lot more agriculture. Let's see, I'm not going to have you do this activity. And I'm not going to read all these things either. But you should look up the crops that were part of what's called the Columbian Exchange. First agricultural revolution, as I said, Fertile Crescent. And then, as you can see, it kind of diffused out from there. The specific examples they use at this part of the chapter is going into Europe. And you may wonder, well, why would it take 1,000 years for this knowledge to get over here? And it's like, well, they did not have anything near modern communication, right? They barely had writing, right? The first civilizations, very simplified form of writing. They didn't have complex civilizations barely. So they're places that didn't have agriculture, right? They were just all hunters and gatherers, right? They weren't really kind of organized. They weren't, and so that's this diffusion of agriculture is an extremely slow process where like small communities of people would find it. You'd have people who would be immigrating from this region who would bring that knowledge with them. Sometimes they would mix in with the locals. Sometimes they'd find places where no one lived and they would just, and so you had these populations kind of coming through. I would say this part of the reading goes into detail about agriculture, very, very tied to, as I said, there was barely any writing, but writing came about partially because people were trying to keep records of their food and how much food they had and storing it, and then larger and larger communities as they become settled, as they're in settlements, and those populations of the settlements got larger and larger. People had to like think of new ways to organize things, and that all took just like a ton of time, plus tons of mistakes, tons of bad management, right? Second agricultural revolution, this is out of the three big agricultural revolutions. I would say a big part of this is the enclosure system, which I think I might have mentioned before. The enclosure system was, it did a combination of things. Agriculture used to be a whole bunch of what were considered communal lands, and there was lots of forests and whatnot, and similar to when I showed you, well, actually, I don't think I did show you that documentary. Never mind. So what that meant is people could kind of still use their hunter and gatherer instincts. They could go out into the forest and they could supplement their own diet with what they would find. They would plant crops and whatnot, but they weren't growing enough to export. They're just growing enough for themselves and their local community. The enclosure system sought to kind of basically end that. And the enclosure system also sought to create a bunch of workers for the newly industrializing cities. And it's like, well, how are you going to do that? Well, you got a bunch of people who are peasants who are living out in the forests and growing their own food, and they don't want to work in factories, right? Factory work at the Industrial Revolution, it was a completely different way of doing things. The actual work in factories was like terribly hard. There were no rules about worker rights, so your boss could just beat you for doing a bad job, could decide to not pay you, do whatever. Right, child labor, you probably have seen some old photos from this time frame when you had little kids, 3, 4, and 5, working in factories, right? That sounds insane, but people didn't have any, they didn't know not to do that, I guess I would say. But also they very often had to, because this enclosure system, well, they closed off the commons, and so you couldn't just go out and get food and try to sustain yourself. So you're starving, right? You and your family. And so it's like, well, what are you gonna do? Move to the city where there are jobs, try to find one. There weren't nearly enough jobs for the amount of people who were displaced by all this. And I would say the enclosure system, it was done by the royalty in Europe. And then during the colonial period, those same European powers just tried to do that to the rest of the world, right? They would go off to a place they would colonize, and they would just basically say, well, this land isn't yours anymore. You could have this little bit of land, but all this is mine, and it's agriculture now. And so I'll pay you a little bit to work it maybe if I need you, but I don't need a lot of people, right? Enclosure system. Oh, and I should say, this little image that they have in this chapter, this is just basically about the crop rotation system. Because, well, farmers everywhere would find out through time that their soils would get exhausted. And very often what that would mean, humans are very mobile creatures. We, real good percentage of our bodies is put together just to walk and move around in an efficient way. And so people would just farm an area until it wouldn't grow crops anymore, and then they would just move to a different area. Of course, if you have an enclosure system and property ownership, you can't do that. And if you want to have food, you got to figure out a sustainable way, right? And I know that sustainability is kind of a recent term that is becoming in vogue, but it was early farmers had to figure out something that was sustainable because there wasn't an endless supply of productive land. They had to figure out, well, what do we do? And it's like, well, rotate crops. There's a lot of different things they would do. Part of the reason that a lot of different crops became cheap is because, well, they had to plant them in a rotation. It's not that there was a big demand for them. So that beans, for example, became a very cheap source of food because they were in that rotation that they had to do. Third agricultural revolution, further mechanization, right? The early mechanization, again, Guns, Germs, and Steel showed us a part of that, of the plow. A plow being pulled by an ox does not seem like a marvel of technology, but it was compared to someone going out and trying to do this by hand, right? So the more we've mechanized, well, the more we've been able to mechanize, the more we have. Today, this includes genetically modified organisms. I would say, actually, that GMOs, in the rest of the world, these tend to be a bit more controversial than they are in the US. I would say in the US, people don't give a lot of thought to what they eat, honestly. You get some fast food and you're not like, hey, is the wheat for this bread, is this like a good source? You know what I mean? It's like, well, just consume it. In much of the rest of the world, possibly because they're more tied to these historical forms of agriculture, they're much more connected to like, well, what is this that I'm eating? Where does this come from? And how was this made? And that type of thing. Like even in Europe actually, there's large-scale protests against modifying the food because they feel like they don't know what that means when we change the genes of food. Does it mean that it's more productive? Does it mean other stuff too? In general, we have found that for the first genetically modified crops tended to have less nutrients because they were formulated for fast growth, again, to maximize the output of product from an area of land. Wasn't until much later that people were like, well, what if we start to modify them so that they have more nutrients and also grow quicker? And that is a thing that has more recently been kind of happening. It still hasn't spread around that much, though, because it's expensive. And these earlier forms of seeds and whatnot are more affordable worldwide. Well, actually, the most affordable thing worldwide is to not buy these new seeds at all, is to just save up your seeds from last year's crop, right? And you plant the seed from last year's crop as your new crop. And that is actually one of the reasons why there's a lot of these heirloom versions of plants around the world, is because people are just using what their ancestors used. Sometimes, in the US, you could get more money for these types of crops because they're more unique, you know what I mean? Like if you go and you buy the corn that is all the different colors and whatnot, it's like, well, those are much older types of crops and varieties, more difficult to grow, but we'll get you more money per corn cob. How do I do that? Green Revolution, very tied to the most modern form of agriculture. Green revolution is, again, not just crops that are more productive, higher yields, but resistant to strains, reduce labor, need less people to be doing it by hand, right? Usually the green revolution is also very much tied to mechanization, right? If you get a couple machines, the amount of labor they could do is a huge amount, right? And the only reason this has been slow to kind of be adapted worldwide is because these machines cost a lot of money. So it tends to be people who already have money who can buy these machines, and then their farms become more productive, and so what happens is those people buy local farms. So the smaller farms go out of business, their wages go down, right? Reduced labor demand is part of the reason they do this. But that's, again, well, as we'll look in the next chapter on urbanization, that's part of the reason why we're having displacement of so many people and they're moving to local cities looking for work. It's because they can't make enough money to survive in rural areas anymore, because it's all just been mechanized. And I know in the US, this is like an old thing, right? We largely mechanized our farming like 100 years ago. Much of the rest of the world, they're still doing it. When I was in India, people were still hands harvesting wheat, you know? And it's like wheat, that was one of the first things to be mechanized. This is a bit of, if you remember when we were looking at Malthus, Thomas Malthus, right? And he is looking at human populations, and he was worried because what he was seeing was that, if you remember one of our chapters on population, that the population was increasing at a quicker rate than we were producing more food, right? And if you remember when we were looking at cornucopians versus Malthusians or even neo-Malthusians, to a certain extent, Malthus had a point that there was a crisis point that was coming, but Malthus in no way really thought that we could make farming more productive, right? And these are some charts from the end of this chapter looking at how the population has increased, even in countries that have had huge population increases, right? India and China, if you remember from our population chapters, huge increases of population. But if you look at investment in technology, new crops, and how much more food, right? China was able to become a huge exporter of food, growing more than enough for its own population. Not saying that Malthus didn't have his point in his time. The other thing that this doesn't really show is, well, not only did we create more food as we grew, but the population is not doing this anymore, right? It's much more stable. Worldwide, the population rate, if you remember, is still growing and it's still increasing, but in much of the world it's stabilized. In places where it's still growing a lot, will probably stabilize in the next 20 to 30 years, which is something that I think Malthus would have never thought would be possible. A lot of people didn't think that would be possible, that human society could change that much. Some more maps from this chapter, basically on what they called plant hardiness, right? These different zones are different climate classifications, and when people are farmers or they're in the agribusiness and they're trying to locate their farms, they really need to take into context what varieties of crops they have, how will they grow in those different climates, right? I mentioned before, these are also maps from this chapter. This is geography of corn, right? You can see, at least they have the states here so I can see where Minnesota is. You can see quite a bit of corn. Part of the reason we have a lot of corn along here and not here is there's actually, well, there's a river here and there's a lot more water. Corn takes a lot of water because it's a tropical, it's a crop that is from a much warmer climate, but as you can see, it's not really grown down here, right? That's because, well, we have more water than those areas do. So new varieties grow here. Soybean, and you can see these overlap because these places do crop rotations. Minnesota, the actual, when we first had our big agricultural boom in the 1800s, and all those small towns kind of started up, the main crops were wheat, but the wheat depleted the soil, and even though that was something that has happened since the dawn of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, we still hadn't really learned about it. And so what happened was the first farmers, they just exhausted the soils, and then they just moved to other states to farm in other states. Farmers who stayed local, they had to figure something else out. And so that's why they switched, right? They're like, well, we can't just grow wheat. It's like, yes, we get the most money for wheat, and everyone was eating wheat, right? Bread is mostly made from just regular wheat. But it was one of those things where it's like, you just physically can't do that and be sustainable, right? You gotta rotate the crops, or else just pack up and move to a different state, which plenty of people did. But plenty of people didn't. All right, I think that's all I'll say on that one. General map of cereal or root crops around the world. As you can see, it's not just our area, but much of the world. To the point that actually wheat, eating wheat products is displacing rice in lots of areas, because rice, although it's still a very productive crop, not only that, but China's actually devised some new strains of rice that will be like 2 to 5 times as much as productive. They'll start planting next summer, which is kind of crazy. But even with those new productive varieties, you still, the mechanization, right? Wheat mechanization, being able to use machines to harvest it and to process it, versus rice that, as you saw, that's still people who have to work in those fields, people who have to do all the work. And so until they can mechanize rice, which, maybe we'll have a bunch of robots in the future that will be able to do it, right now it's not the case. Actually, I'm not going to debate this. We've got plenty of time for some questions in small groups. Just gonna shuffle these cards and come out and do the hand out cards thing. The clock in the back, the right time. Oh yeah, it's mostly right. Okay. Difficult questions. These questions are also in the end of this chapter. I don't usually use the book's questions to figure out my own, but I thought I would give it a shot.